I wanted to introduce the concept of drawbacks in chess for those who aren't familiar with this term, because I think it's an incredibly important way to think about the game and should go a long way to improving your play once you start thinking about the concept of drawbacks. So the first question is, what are drawbacks? So Maurice Ashley made a course something like about 10 years, well, actually this was 2010, so 11 years ago at this point. So I got this back at the round around the time it was introduced, and the title of it is The Secret to Chess. And if you read the description, you see this notation down here, drawback chess. And I highly recommend you get this course, if you're able to, because it's actually a fantastic way of thinking about the game in a new way. And what he says basically in the course is that every move that's played in the game by both you and your opponent has some kind of drawback. And the idea, of course, is that when you move, you want to ensure that your move doesn't have any drawbacks that can be exploited. And when the opponent moves, you want to try to identify any drawbacks that occur in the opponent's move. And so what he does in that course is he goes through master level games to show points where the opponent makes a mistake that can be exploited. Sometimes it can be considered a blunder. Obviously that occurs far less at the higher the level in the game you go. And at master level play, it's of course much more rare. But the idea is to look at what drawback a move might have. And although he doesn't use this terminology in his course, what I've done in thinking about this problem sort of over the years and getting used to thinking about the game in terms of drawbacks is I've created four categories here, and I'll go through a number of examples to show how these work. And I call them arriving, leaving, oblivious, ignore, and unavoidable. So the idea is with arriving is that the opponent's piece that moves or pawn that moves becomes some kind of target is typically the idea of an arriving move. So the square that the piece arrives on causes some kind of problem that can be exploited. The second category is leaving, which is you're obviously vacating a square every time you move something, and that may create a weakness. Maybe things are undefended by the square you left. Maybe it creates, if a pawn moves forward, the squares that it previously protected are now no longer protected. That could be the feature of the move. So the square that you're leaving is the theme of the problem. Oblivious ignore is when the opponent could have dealt with the problem that was at hand, but either didn't see it or didn't evaluate it properly. And so they had the opportunity to correct the exploitability of the situation, but just didn't evaluate it correctly and maybe wanted to do something that pushed their agenda without thinking enough about the threats that they were facing. And the fourth category is what I call unavoidable, which is where even if the opponent does recognize a weakness in their position, they they can't do anything about it. There's no move that will correct the problem. This could be considered possibly not explicitly a category of drawback, but I included it for the reason that it will apply specifically in tactics problems specifically, which I'll do as a separate topic. But I think it's important to introduce it now as something to think about. So the best way to go through these examples is to look at some actual problems and and see if we can identify it. So lately, as I've been doing tactical puzzles on Wii Chess, I've now moved the rating to harder, the harder category, which is the fourth level out of five, and was initially struggling with some of the problems because obviously they become a lot more tricky. But I try to think of the problems in these terms, in terms of drawbacks. So let's quickly look at three puzzles just to introduce the concept. So what I've done is these are ones that I've tried to solve recently, with some with success and some not. And we turn the engine on, and just to be sure that we see the evaluation changing to really show how drawbacks work. So white has just played queen to c2 and is threatening the capture on h7. So black has, as you can see with the engine analysis here, it looks quite threatening. Obviously, it's threatening checkmate. And black has a number of ways to solve this, as the engine is pointing out. So it could be the knight on h, which is obviously a target. It could come into f6 and therefore defend the square on h7, which is the checkmate square right now, with the queen sitting here on c2. It also could simply capture on g5, which is still a little scary because the h file would then be opened. H would recapture on g, and then this rook would look a little scary. But as international master Andres Toth always says, scary is not analysis. You can't just be scared. You've got to calculate it through. And then we see that after h captures, we could play rook on f to c8, threatening the queen. And let's just step through that actually. So if we capture on g, then white recaptures and we play that, loosening the square for the escapes, creating the escape square on f8 for the king, so that if the white queen comes into there, the king could then just escape. So let's go back to the beginning of the problem. So we play that, and so the engine's highlighting, and then of course even g6, right? Just so simply blocking the diagonal access of the queen to h7 and thus preventing the move. And white could, of course, recapture, but black would still have a huge advantage simply recapturing. And it actually suggests that playing f to c8 again is the right thing to do first, because this creates, of course, tempo on the queen. It has to go back to b1, and then we can simply recapture the knight. So if we go back to the beginning, black had a number of opportunities to deal with this problem, but instead plays, and you can see the evaluation of about 6.5 pawns that black is leading at this point, but instead plays rook on f to c8 right away. And as you can see, the evaluation has changed by almost 10 pawns. So white is now leading by, and of course you don't see this evaluation as you're trying to solve the problem. This is a problem I've already either solved or tried to solve and didn't get it right. So this shows a huge drawback in black's last move. So the question is, which of these categories is it? So arriving, leaving, oblivious, ignore, and unavoidable. So the square it's arriving on. So what I always try to do is, as I think about these problems, is let's look at the squares that the piece moved from and to. So it's arrived on c8, and that obviously means that it could be a target of the queen. But as we look at this, and the idea right now isn't to go into in-depth calculation, it's just to get an initial visualization of the problem. So if rook on f goes to c8, it does become a target. So if queen were to capture, the rook would simply recapture, and black would be absolutely fine. So it's likely not an arriving problem. It's also likely not a leaving problem, meaning the square that it left on f8 doesn't really seem exploitable. I mean, if we could somehow play like queen to c5 or something and maybe attack the square, it's a possibility. But black's got excellent protection on the back rank. This c5 square is covered, so it's likely not one of the two. So with this evaluation changing so much, we can comfortably say that this problem falls in the category of ignore, right? So oblivious ignore. So black could have dealt with this checkmate problem, but instead chose not to and tried to push their own agenda by attacking the queen. But as we see in the engine analysis, what happens is the drawback of this move is it allows queen takes h7 for free. This is forced, king to f8. We come back to queen h5, threatening, again, checkmate on e5. Black can defend by playing to e5, which of course guards the f7 square and prevents checkmate, but falls into, and this is actually, I didn't originally think of this, but this is another example of a drawback. So as the knight moves into, as the knight moves into e5, that comes with a drawback all of its own. Now, what black's obviously trying to do is in being desperate to avoid checkmate, he's now opened this 7th rank where the queen and the 2 rooks can, of course, move to the 7th rank to help guard f7. But this move here has a drawback of its own, and that comes in the category of arriving. category 1, because what happens now is that the pawn, of course, can just recapture. So we've captured on h7, we've captured another knight here, and we're still, of course, threatening checkmate. So black has to then cover that square. So black's completely on the defensive now. And the idea here is that the queen can then capture on f7, which of course has to be dealt with, and then the queen recaptures, knight recaptures, and king recaptures, and so white can just continue to push here, and has got a massive pawn advantage on the king side, which then can be exploited to try to convert. And so, in black's threats, although it's bearing down on the king here, we've gotten rid of the queen, which was a huge attacker, and black capturing on e1 will not do much, as we can just simply recapture with one of the rooks. Both are good, but the engine prefers centralizing the rooks with the h capture. So that problem actually had 2 drawbacks. If we go look at another example, this is the last problem I solved. Actually, it wasn't this one. This one I wanted to look at. So if we go to here and we say view the solution. Okay, so this is the beginning of the problem. So we can see that white has a queen on e7, and it's white's turn to move. And the engine evaluation shows white is leading. So as long as white does not make a horrendous move that features a drawback, the game should continue, and white should have an advantage, not a massive advantage, but a reasonably good sized one. And so as you see here, the Stockfish 11 is recommending queen to c5, or queen to a5, and even king to b2, because there's a major threat coming to the white king. And so if you look at the problem, obviously queen going to e5, if we could do 2 moves here in a row, we would be able to checkmate on b1, because the king would not be able to go to d2. So this is another example of an ignore category 3, where white clearly had some moves available that could allow the game to continue with an advantage for white, but instead just didn't think about the problem completely, or ignore the threat to his own king. So white plays, instead of going to the 2 dark squares here on c5 and a5, instead plays queen to a4. And you can see the evaluation swing quite dramatically. So the delta here is about 6.5 pawns between the last move and this. So white's obviously played a move that has a tremendous drawback that we can then exploit with the black pieces. So in this case, I was looking at this, and I considered rook, of course, to e1 first, and it's a good idea to look at checks first, but I don't want to go really into the methodology of solving tactics. I'll leave that to a totally separate category. But to exploit the drawbacks, we can then do this move, which again threatens checkmate. So the white queen here on a4 cannot do anything because it's blocked by the pawns to solve this problem. So black plays king to b2 to avoid the check with the checkmate, with the idea of if a check arrives on b1 with the queen, then the white king can escape to a3. But what that allows is, as we brought the king, the black queen across to e4, is the idea that then rook to a8 could be played. So it's now perfectly covered by the queen, and so the evaluation should be that white has to then go into this exchange. So the evaluation of our line was that it's rook for queen, and the black queen simply recaptures. And although it's not a monstrous lead, it's a significant lead. White still has some counterplay with the fact that they have 3 pawns pushing with no opposition down here. So it's still black's going to have to play correctly to win the game. But as you can see in the evaluation, it's almost a 5-pawn lead. So that was a tactic that black was able to exploit. And that was all created by the first move by white, which featured a drawback. So as you're playing your games, think about these categories and what drawback the opponent's move might have. And when it's your turn to move, the idea, of course, is to not make a move with any sort of exploitable drawback, which means the opponent will have to outplay you. And if you can make moves without drawbacks yourself, the probability that the opponent will make a mistake at some point, of course, rises dramatically. And his point, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, because I haven't watched the course in a while, is that Maurice makes the point that if you start to think about the game in this way, you can improve your rating by something like 200 points pretty quickly by just not making mistakes. And so it's very important as you go to consider a candidate move, what square are you leaving, what square are you arriving at, and does that create any drawbacks? So I hope this helped as an introduction, and I'll continue to feature themes that cover drawbacks in this playlist to help with the understanding, because of course it's always better to show examples from games in order to show how this works.